Welcome to another episode of Silver Lining for Learning. This is the episode where the hosts get together and discuss and reflect on what has happened, both with our discussions in previous episodes, as well as our own observations, our own reading, our own lives. Today is a very strange day, to me. I've seen the Falcon 9 going up with real people. And we also have seen what's happening is um, the widespread protest in different cities in the U.S. We're seeing the Indian pandemic possibly, but also schools have different reactions. I've seen in South Korea, for example, schools have been closed again. Some of schools got closed again because they discovered a spike of cases. I'm sure, in Brazil, the situation is even more challenging. So we don't know when this might end, what's going to happen. So today we're going to reflect and talk. And but I would like to start with every one of us, each and every one of us, to make a personal statement to say what you're thinking about, what's been going through. So Chris, why don't we start with you?
Well, this past week has been Harvard's commencement week. It's very late in the year. They want to make sure that we really earn our May salaries. And I was asked to talk to our master's students in technology, innovation, and education. And I'm just going to briefly recapitulate what I said to them because it's on my mind.
Chris, how large is the program?
About 70 this year. And I use three quotes. The first is from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. The classic beginning is that it is the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. And I wanted to just remind the students that what we're going through is unusual in our recent history, but not at all unusual in the long history of humanity, that we periodically have times like this. And I said to them, as Dickens points out, we can either view the glass as half full or we can view it as half empty. And in the blog that I posted this week on Silver Lining for Learning about what we should be talking to children about, I said I view it as half full because the pandemic, which is terrible, is undercutting the dead hand of the past and the compliance mentality of the present, and it's opening an opportunity to change things. So I also oscillate like Dickens between despair and feeling that there's an opportunity. But on balance, I choose to reinforce the latter. And then I quoted Lemony Snicket, children's author, perhaps not quite in the same category as Dickens, because often when I talk to people about the opportunity, they say, well, this is great, but I'm not ready. Well, Lemony Snicket says, if you wait until you're ready, you'll be waiting for the rest of your life. And I think that's true. The heroes that we have had on the show have been people who chose to act even though they weren't ready, because they cared so much about kids that they were going to get out there and do something. And I think that kind of an attitude about being ready for something this complicated is never going to happen. And then the third quote, and then I'll stop my summary of my talk. I had never known who said this, but I looked it up on the internet. Somebody I never heard of, a pastor in 1907, who said, it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And I see a lot of that dialogue in LinkedIn and social media where there's a lot of people cursing the darkness, but there's a few people who are lighting those candles. And I think this show is about people who are lighting candles, and maybe when we put them together, we'll get some kind of a flame.
Thanks, Chris. Well, let me ask actually Kurt. Kurt, do you want to say a few words?
I do, but I ask Chris a question to make this interactive. Chris, the 70 students in your online masters, are they face-to-face or online, and how has that changed over time?
Well, the program has always been face-to-face. It's a one-year program, very intense.
Wow.
And of course, like every other program, we went online in mid-March to everybody's, consternation. And we were able to finish out the semester, I think, in good shape.
We used to have that large of a master's program, over 90, in fact, but now we have that in our online. Our face-to-face is a handful of people. It's really changed. The complexity.
Well, that may be true for us next year. And the students were depressed about it. And I said, look, if you think you're depressed, think about the students who are majoring in hotel and restaurant management.
Yeah, there's a lot of people making kind of reflecting on their life and what they're going to do over the next year, which is the point I want to raise. And going back to that point, our EDD program is exploding. It's online. Our PhD program is kind of plateaued and dropping off. The students are now, the majority are online ones, and that's changing what I do. And this will be the same in the K-12 space. What teachers do for their lives, what they plan to do, what they look at them, how they plan their life, how they schedule their time. Everything's being impacted in one way or another. So I want to start with, I'm going to end with that kind of reflection. But first of all, I shared a few articles with all of you last night. I'll just read the titles of those. I've called them up here. I shared 4 K-12 articles that just came out in the past week. The first one being, I thought, the most impressive one by Anya Kamenetz of NPR, a survey showing that there's large learning gaps for those on the low end of the income scale and for those with special needs. And my daughter's finding that as an occupational therapist. Kids in their low income area where she teaches in Clovis, New Mexico, just aren't coming to her OT sessions. And there's a lot of kids being left behind. So one thought is that we might pick up on. Another article was about a lot of companies in the online space making claims for which they don't have the data to back up. And that's been true for a long time, but apparently it's becoming even more true today. And they quoted Robert Slavin, who's not one person I always read, but I read him back when he was popular for his cooperative reading stuff 40 years ago. And he's created a center to evaluate these online learning programs. That was the second article. The third article was talking about the thing that caught my attention. 1 in 5 teachers are unlikely to return to reopen classrooms in the fall. I'm going to come back to that point. The fourth article was about monitoring student attendance and how schools in Indianapolis, in the Indianapolis area, are monitoring attendance. And that article was so popular in the Indy Star, the USA Today picked it up and republished it a day later. And then there are 2 articles in higher ed this week that are being passed around a lot. And that's from the New York Times. Remember the MOOCs, after near death, they're booming. And then an article from Udemy showing a surge in online education. And so it's 2 of those points I want to bring up. And one is the article that 1 in 5 teachers may not return to teaching. And it has me reflecting on, what percent of professors will not return as a professor? What percent of administrators will no longer be an administrator? What percent of students will no longer want to be face-to-face students, will want to be online ones, whether it's K-12 in middle school, high school, or higher ed? What percent of anything? There'd be shifts in at pretty much every area. And that if it's just 10%, that's dramatic. But if it's 20%, as the article says, it's probably overstated. It's probably not going to be 1 in 5. But right now, maybe many teachers feel that, they look at it and they say, no, there's no way I'll return. There's no way I can, I can do what I've done in the past. or they'll explore new occupations in the interim, in the summer or during the break. So one thing we might want to ask ourselves about or talk about is if there's a percent of people that do change their occupations, what does that mean for education in the future and so forth. The other thing is the articles that came out about MOOCs and the explosion thereof. It was really quite interesting to read what people were taking. Number one area of explosion is office productivity. Number two is health and fitness. 84% increase in courses on health and fitness, 150% increase in office productivity, IT and software, 77%, and personal development, 61%. And if you look at the specific courses, the topics include creativity, which Punya would like, growth mindset, innovation, communication, teamwork, neural networks, for whatever that means, Pilates, ukulele. And in certain countries, it was different. In Spain and in Italy, they were taking courses in Spain in piano, number one, 466% increase. And in Italy, guitar, 400% increase. But in India, business fundamentals, 281% increase, and communication skills, 606% increase. Communication, business productivity in India, whereas Spain and Italy are playing piano and guitar. Oh, that was kind of interesting too. Just we can't make general statements across the board about how people are coping or moving ahead in this age of COVID. So those are a couple of things that I'll share with you, and maybe we'll reflect on one or two of those things after. But Udemy, if anyone in the audience doesn't know who Udemy is, they're in the south of Market District of San Francisco, and they will let anyone create a course online for free or with a price on it. So your grandmother could create a course in Udemy. You could create a course in Udemy, and they're exploding now because of this new age we're in. So,
well, thanks, Kurt.
Yep.
That's very helpful, and thank you. By the way, there are some people asking if you could put the articles, maybe as Scott was
Sure.
suggesting, a blog post on silver lining on the website. If you could create a link of those, I found them to be extremely useful. Scott, do you have some similar data to share?
No, but I have a couple thoughts. So, I guess I have two big wonders for us right now, and this is for us collectively as a group. Yang, you launched this initiative and invited us to join you to really talk about how can learning and teaching be reimagined in the wake of the pandemic. And I've loved our guests. I think that our guests have shared some really interesting things that are happening around the world in terms of learning and teaching and technology. Been very impressed with the guest bloggers that we've had on our site. Their passion for the change work, the ideas and strategies that they're changing are great. I think one of the things that I'm wondering right now is that I wonder if we, as a group of hosts, have made the through line explicit enough. In other words, it's great to talk about interesting things that could happen, but how do we help people get from where we are now through the pandemic and to those things? And I don't know if we've spent a lot of time, again, it's the systems guy in me, right? Thinking about how do we help people transition? Like, it's great to see these cool things happening, but how do we get there, right? In whatever our local contexts are. And I don't know if I wonder if we have spent enough time or energy yet talking about those through lines and how to help people get all the way over to wherever they think they want to go. So that's a big wonder for me. The second big wonder for me is that a lot of what we're talking about here requires access to devices and access to bandwidth. And, I love when we talk to some of our guests from other countries or from areas within the US that are being very creative about workarounds on the access and equity issue. But I wonder if we have still spent enough time talking about what are those through lines to help people get access to devices and bandwidth. Like, we've talked about it as an issue, but we haven't talked about how to help people get it. So those are my two big wonders right now. And I guess I'll close, Kurt shared a few articles that have caught his eye recently got an email the other day from ASCD that said superintendents are seeking relief from technology vendors. In other words, during this, pandemic time, about half of school superintendents have begged ed tech vendors to stop contacting them, right, and trying to make money off them because they're dealing with other things right now. And I think that's an interesting perspective on all this. So those are my opening thoughts.
Well, thanks, Scott. I think we'll definitely deal with those issues. I think, by the way, all of this, I'm just inviting all of you to put, what's on your mind on the table. Then we'll come back to deal with them. We'll also take questions from the audience as well. Shuangye, do you want to share something, what you've been thinking about?
Yes, okay. Thanks for inviting those speakers from all around the world, and we can really see in the details and in the different programs how teachers, principals, researchers are gathering their joint efforts. Yeah, so although we are in different regions with different scale of this pandemic is progressing, but we do see how those educational professionals joined by the parents and also involving students to move towards or move ahead. Of course, this I see that kind of uncertain, this is a great uncertainties in our century. Yes. What I have observed from the last sessions are this the two things. The first is how the different places they have constructed their own problems, contextualize their own problems and also their own solutions. No matter whether in the very small countries, based on their previous infrastructure, and also they are all fabricate. They have to build up new solutions, or they still keep this community places open during the pandemic. We can see this kind of diversity, and even in China. Yeah, now we will see, although we have moved quickly to this kind of a new norm, this is a really, we can actually, aside from this, especially in Shanghai, in Beijing, aside from those kind of protections on campus, otherwise you will see nothing different from those schooling before the pandemic. Yeah. And the second one I would like to share is how much the concerns about equity, equity issues are shared in the sessions. Yeah. And currently this is the period of what we called the two conferences, the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference are taking place in China. And we can see those representatives in China, they are very concerned about how those this technology and also online learning can be further integrated into the normal physical schooling life, and also the equality issues about the people in the more marginal places. However, I still want to raise this kind of counter intuitive concern about this equality. Even if those kids are not in school for half a year or even for 1 year. This is, I think this what Professor Yong Zhao mentioned in the initiatives of our project. What would really they lose? Yeah. Now we will see, at least in the American context, school functioned as a great, played a great role of a kind of this like school lunch or other social functions. That's what we call this. We could educate, educationalization the education or school. That means we use education or school to solve some part of those social problems. However, if we back to the education, if we could unschool those kids for a period of time, I think this maybe is a kind of experiment for us to think about this kind of emancipation, this kind of a natural experiment of emancipation. Yeah, so I still want to raise this kind of concern. It's really, in what kind of sense can we think from this kind of counterintuitive perspective about equality? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. I like that, this big experiment. So what happens, that's the point I'm going to raise, and we're going to carry on the conversation. Thank you for sharing that. Punya.
Thank you. Thank you all. So, Chris, I really want to thank you for starting with that quote from Charles Dickens. Honestly, just speaking personally, if you ask me over the last couple of days, seeing a silver lining has been hard for me. And this is just a completely personal statement. I think what this COVID-19 and the events of the last few days have sort of starkly revealed to us are how deep the inequalities are there within our society and how little we have been able to help address, resolve them, and so on. But given that we are silver lining for learning, couple of things that from the last few guests that I think that we need to be thinking about. So thank you, Scott. Actually really appreciate the sort of the through line point that you raised. And Kurt, the NPR story also sort of resonated with me about who is not getting it, right? And so that was a piece that resonated from the two guests we had the past two, so from the one from Italy, where Nicoletta talked about that, yeah, we have some data from the teachers who participated, but we have nothing from the ones who didn't. And that's sort of the 1 in 5 who may not be coming back. And why is the reason that they're not coming back? If they're not coming back for a genuine reason, I don't want to be in education. But if there are good experienced teachers who we are losing, that's a huge loss. I think those are kinds of things we need to think about. And I think what Sean Lesher sort of brought up very strongly, and that's part of the reason why I was so glad that Sean joined us, was sort of the moral dimension of the work that we do. That the work that we do has to be deeply humanistic, has to, like his statements about how that at this time, the first thing we should be asking ourselves are who are the ones who are most disadvantaged. That's rather than as Chris, you pointed out in your comment in that conversation, that schools saying either we will do nothing if we can't reach everybody, or we will just focus on the ones that we can reach. And just as Shamir was talking about flipping the equation, what Sean did was he flipped it. He said, no, that's the group that we have to reach out the most. And I think that over the past few months, and I've joked about this, that I am always the sort of the negative nanny or whatever in this group, which is fine. I mean, which is rare for me, but I'm okay with that label. But I'll be honest. I mean, it has been a very challenging sort of questions to ask ourselves as to what we do, who we are, how did we get here, how do we go forward. But also, I know this, right, that the only hope, only sort of possible forward is education. That is the only way that we can address these issues, that we can address both, whether it is figuring out a solution to the virus, whether it's epidemiological, biological, sociological, whatever we need to do, but also the democratic citizens, the institutions that we build, how we make those sustainable, strong, resilient, respectful of people. Education is the only way. The challenge I have is that I think all of us, most of us who are in the ed tech field, and I would put myself in that, guilty of that as well, which is we often, so the analogy I would give is COVID-19 does not discriminate who it attacks. However, the impact of COVID-19 is felt very differentially depending on your racial, cultural, social, socioeconomic background. The same way, EdTech does not discriminate in terms of who it can help. However, the impact of it is felt very differentially depending on where along the spectrum you lie. And that NPR story, thanks Kurt again, is sort of indicative of that. So somebody dropped a note, I think, on saying that, that I hope that the discussion as we move forward focuses on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The quote on the back there saying that intelligence plus character, that how do we bring discussions of these moral dimensions? Then I think educators, we have often not felt comfortable talking about issues of morals and so on, because it infringes on things around religion and so on. But I think that unless we do that, that space gets picked up by other people with other voices. And I think we need to figure out ways of doing that as well. And I think that, so I don't have any solutions per se, but I think the silver lining, I think, is partly that we are engaged in this conversation. I think we need to ask hard, deep questions of ourselves. And I mean, the 6 of us here, as well as the broader community, who's being included in this conversation, who is not, in our guests that we've invited, who have we called and who have we not? What have we covered and what have we not? I think those are really important questions for us to ask ourselves if we are to be honest in this time of what I feel is a significant crisis. But again, going back to Chris and the quote that he started, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. The question is, which one would we pick? And I think as educators, we have no choice but pick the spring of hope. Because otherwise, why educate, right? Why learn? Why teach? But I think that we should also not be insensitive or not unaware of how deep those challenges are. And sometimes that our answers can almost be flippant in the face of what are some very significant challenges. So that's it. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
If I can just build on that for a second.
I just put our 6th face on the screen for everybody to see us. I have a few things to share, then we'll just dive into this. I think it's, first of all, thanks, Scott, for raising that question. When I caught you guys want to do this, I had no idea what it was going to be. I just said, okay, let's try it to see if it's going to work. I'm so happy I did this. There was no plan. There was no idea. I just thought it would be fun to have a conversation among all of us. So that was really my design. I think it has achieved that so far. My thinking, based on this, I've been really thinking a lot about, can we not have a school? When we return to this thing, can we have different ways of organizing learning based on smaller groups, based on students sharing online, learning online? Can we reorganize? I'm thinking, I know that's impossible right now, but I'm just thinking different kind of learning. I know that a lot of parents are thinking about homeschooling. A lot of them are getting different ways to arrange that. But again, that's not for everybody. We also know today, not all students have to graduate to work. Unlike the traditional mass industrial society, a lot of people can work when they're age 5, age 9, age 10. They're working and they're actually doing different kind of things. Can we not have all this pathway of schooling? And we also know that many schools are going to face this issue of doing both online and face-to-face. That's kind of a de facto. That's going to happen, And if that's the case, if the online part cannot be cross-district, cross-countries, cross-different places, We've also been talking a lot about personalization. If personalized learning of the curriculum, maybe we can have more options. We can have creating more possibilities. So I've been really thinking a lot. But the final thing I want to share with you, all of you, is I was talking to Chris. I feel very depressed, Punya. I don't know, that's why we went to graduate school together. The last few days, I've not been feeling very well. It's serious, I don't know. I just, when I look at the images of the news, it's shocking to me what we're going through. But then, I was talking to Chris, there were worse times. I bet there were. So I'm thinking, this is a good time. This is a good time. If any one of you in audience listening to us feeling depressed, it's okay. So let's have a conversation.
So
Yeah, if I can build on that point just briefly, I have a colleague, Richard Malika, at Harvard, who is a psychiatrist for more than 25 years. He's been head of the Harvard Program for Refugee Trauma. And he basically cares about who cares for the caregivers. So if you're running a refugee camp or a hospice or a battered women's shelter or any of the other horrible kinds of jobs, how do you keep going? How do you keep from burning out within a month or 2 months? And his book, Healing Invisible Wounds, is really a summary of how he, as a psychiatrist, thinks about helping people to heal themselves when they're experiencing this kind of time. It's very thoughtful. I don't get any royalties on this, but I would urge you to take a look at his book if you're feeling a lot of despair, because it's very, very thoughtful about this.
Thank you, Chris. Anyone else wants to jump in before I throw a question at some of you guys?
So I just want to say one thing, Zhao, to follow up on your last comment, right? And this question of in a perfect world, or, and I have a friend who says, when we are talking about something, he'll be like, in a perfect world, we would, and my answer to him always has been, this is the perfect world. That's the only one we got. And
well, that's true.
You know what I mean? I mean, this is it. For good or for bad or whatever, this is it. But I think it makes the imperative for having that honest, straight conversation and not thinking of some ideal or some whatever. This is what we have. This is the playground we've been given. This is what we play, right? I think that's sort of my sort of coming back to reality on this. And I think that's the only thing that, like I said, it's been clear that, that for more than one of us, and this has been a difficult few weeks and days, but I think that's the thing, is education is the only way that we can think of going forward. And Chris, just to follow up on what you said, one of the things that Sean Lesher talked about last week is how he set up somebody who could be a resource for his teachers and staff, which he felt was as important as looking, because they are also facing the brunt of it at so many levels. And I hope schools and school districts keep that in mind as they go forward, that it's not just the students who are in need, it is the people serving the students also who might have serious trauma and challenges as well.
I remember back in 2001 at Ed Media conference in Tampere, Finland, and the keynote was talking about not school. And it had me fascinated. And I'm blanking on his name right now, but Richard Millwood runs the program now, after he took over at Anglia Ruskin University. And I might be able to look up some of the principles behind not school and share them with all of you. Maybe I could put a post up or something in Silver Lining for Learning before really as online learning was taking off. But they were helping the kids who had been bullied in school, didn't fit in and whatnot. And your notion of smaller schools or alternative schools and you said not school, in fact. So that's what led me to that comment. The other thing I want to get back to Scott's point about what comes from this? What do people gain from this? And I wonder if Silver Lining for Learning could develop or put on the website some sidebar where people could post some goals or commitments or something they're going to do as a result of the various programs that they've watched in here. Or they're sort of doing that through their blog posts. But I wonder if we can create some kind of very simple tool for them to do that. And we could kind of read them and reflect on them. Maybe we could pull out one a week of someone who talked about how they're changing or how they're planning to change and comment on it somehow. Just a thought.
Well, I think, Kurt, and Scott, this goes to all our audience. Feel free to jump in, give us some ideas. I think there's several things that's kind of cool that's happening with us. First of all, we have different learning backgrounds. We have different space to observe in our own way, professionally, so because we are in different places, you look at each one of us. So each one of us may have a different spin on this idea, what works, what may not. So I think that's a cool thing. I'm so happy to have that, So when we talk about the different goals, objectives, I'm quite resisting the idea of having one type of program or one type of outcomes. I think we should, let's keep the diversity in going here. You know, we will be inviting different people from different perspectives. I think that's one thing I like. We did not have a predefined set of rules, criteria, even though we have a general agreement. That's really a good thing. The second thing, actually, I'm very interested in exploring with all of you, judging from what we heard from different places, is that maybe in the next episode for all of us to talk again, it could be interesting for us to explore some of the good things we have heard, some of the good silver linings we have heard as a summary, you know, from different perspectives, you know, not necessarily to force them into one set, but maybe multiple sets. Something like that would be quite interesting, useful to think about.
Yeah, you know, I think that's what I was trying to say with my first wonder, is that we've got a bunch of great ideas and initiatives that we've highlighted over our first 10 weeks or so. But how do we help people connect the dots, right? So you saw this interesting thing happening over here. You were inspired by the moral purpose of this person or group over here. How do you translate that into your local context? What are some steps you can take to make it happen, right?
Yes, that's actually, that's a great idea. Another thing that Scott, and actually, again, I want to invite audience. The audience is having conversations. I'm not watching them. I'm sure you guys are watching them. I can't multitask very well. But one thing I think we could do, which we have been doing, we should do more, is to do possibly more blog posting, more private conversations. And I don't know how do we share that, how we do that. You know, another issue is of course, you know, with the you look at all of us here. I think we're getting into summer. We're going to have more time, possibly. Some of us are going to have more time. Maybe we can do more of this, to have more conversations with the people. But at the same time, I think it's significant for us to say, okay, where are we going? You know, after we build all these different models, we have different countries coming in, different players coming in. I anticipate stories will be very similar. You know, I think Jared Foster from Canada, you know, was raising a question about, you know, we're managing a crisis. How do we go beyond that? You know, where do we go from here? I think that's going to be in the future. Punya, go ahead.
Yeah, so Zhao, I love that idea of of more conversations. And I'm wondering, because I've been sort of thinking a lot about this whole issue of character and values and leadership. And I'm wondering whether, and I've been almost thinking of doing like a similar version of this, but making it more like interviews with leaders, education leaders, other leaders, around understanding better how they define their role in that space, how they take decisions. So I was wondering, and I've been thinking of doing something here out at ASU, but I'm wondering whether it also makes sense to do it as a spin-off of a Silver Lining, which would be sort of these one-on-one conversations. I mean, I've been doing this series that I've been writing for Tech Trends, where we've been interviewing, you were interviewed on that, Zhao, you know, a while back, you know, and we've been doing that for 6 years now. But if podcasts had existed back then, I think it would make a wonderful podcast or webinar, right? Webcast. But I'm thinking, I mean, so maybe we can consider something like that, where each one of us can take. So I love, for instance, Scott's thing of what are the kind of systemic changes that we can bring. And Scott's been doing this amazing thing where he's been talking to school leaders for these 10-minute or 15-minute conversations for the, I don't know how many you have, Scott, but you have quite a bunch. And so I'm wondering whether that is another way of thinking about it, that we can keep the silver lining. And, you know, Kurt, there are things that, I mean, there are things I think all of us together have a mutual interest, but we each have sort of little spin-off things that make sense from a more personal point of view or professional point of view, whatever we may think about it. That could be another way of thinking of sort of branching the silver lining out while keeping that core identity, so that we meet, you know, every Saturday or whatever it is, but on the side, we're also doing this, which is again going on the Silver Lining website, which is going out on Twitter. And so it's spreading the word, but allowing sort of the, if not 1,000 flowers, at least like, you know, 6 flowers to bloom, right? Just a thought. I hadn't thought of this before, but it just struck me as you were speaking.
Well, Punya, we have talked about it a little bit as a host group, right? It's this idea of we might have a primary guest or set of guests every Saturday, but there's lots of interesting people to talk to and think with, right? And so how do we have these side conversations? Like you said, we video them, however, right? And we throw them up as blog posts, right? In addition to the weekly episodes. And that's where we might be able to explore some implementation issues in some more depth. And so I would encourage all of us to just do that, right? Nothing's holding us back.
I also like the Punya's idea of interviews, and I think the people we bring in would enjoy being interviewed and having that as something that would exist and reside on the Silver Lining website after their session. In fact, some people do these before the session to attract more people. They have interviewed, people who are coming in, and then they advertise that interview, and then, people are attracted to what they had to say. So I think interviews are a lot of fun to do. They're very informative, somewhat formal, somewhat very informal. It's kind of the way you do it, Punya, is excellent in Tech Trends. I read those and I gain a lot from them.
So,
go ahead, Punya.
I lost my chain of thought. Sorry.
Oh, it's all right. I will say something, then you'll be back. I'm actually really basing it saying that we started this as a very simple thing, just to get ideas, get people involved, and see how we can drive this change. I think we have now come at a time we can rethink about this. We got a very good loyal audience of about 30 or 40 people that come with us. Thank you guys for being there and with us. But we want to offer something more and something, after all the kind of preliminary scan of the situation, where do you want to go from there? Punya, okay, I was just waiting for you.
Yeah, so I just realized one of the issues is, and Jung-Ye is great to join us every morning, at 5:30 in the morning. But I think we lose some of our guests, especially in the international space, because of the time. And I think that if we are willing to do sort of, offline, like sort of interviews which are not at this specific time, but they can end up on our website, I think it increases the potential group of people that we can invite. And I really want to do, I've been thinking more and more about it. And I think the conversation with Sean sort of pushed me over the edge, that I really want to better understand where and how we bring this issue of character and sort of ethics into the leadership space, and how that can be, I'm just incredibly interested in that. And I would love to, take that on and run with it and then make this a part of Silver Lining. I think it enriches the Silver Lining website and the work that we are doing, but doesn't add more work to other people, because that's something which is a pet passion of mine, right? So collectively we grow. So I'm really sort of thinking that would be a great idea. And I think it connects with some of the work that I'm doing at ASU around this idea of learning futures and leadership, which I think Scott and I can talk more about in some form or the other, because Scott, I've been thinking of reaching out to you around that. So, I think that's one possible way that I think we can continue this conversation, but I think this conversation will get richer and richer as we expand sort of the threads of the various conversations that are happening.
Oh yeah, did you want to say something?
We might think about having a one show a month, early morning on a Saturday morning here in the US, so that people in Japan and China and Korea and India, be late afternoon in India and in the Middle East, and it'd be nighttime before people go to bed in China and in Korea. We might want to experiment once with that. I'm not a morning person, but I think once would be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I just want to jump in as an advertisement. That is, you can consider the most traditional way, that is to publish on our journal. We have this kind of space as commentary and report, and we can also create a kind of special issue, because I think we have a lot of the great ideas, even for our audience. They always have those kind of insightful comments and good questions, and we have already included Zhao and Yong and Punya's comments in our journal. So how can we turn those blogs and also conversations, especially those very important questions, that is, how can we drive those sustainable change first as kind of a series of comments or a kind of dialogue or forum on paper. Yeah, because this is an open access journal and you can spread them around. At least we can have a more voice in the traditional way and also in innovative in a new way. And also I'm introducing a kind of a sideline of this journal and we still run because we include them as a kind of big change question. This is global sourcing, intellectual sourcing, that is crowdsourcing of ideas. That is, so we have this kind of a Chinese program in China. This will be going on this morning, but we inviting more teachers and frontline practitioners sharing their experience. For example, how would they, for example, do our PBL, problem-based learning, on certain topics, and how can we instill those or introduce those humanistic ideas in that. So that is different from this type, but we are running this kind of experiment and to reach out to more and a wider audience in different language. So this what we can consider, that is how can we have this kind of a joint effort from different perspectives.
So if I can just follow up on that, I think I just published a commentary based on the 2 blog posts on the value of school, which was on the silver lining. And the process was amazing, incredibly supportive, quick turnaround. And so I just second that for everybody, both here in this group on screen, as well as people online, that if there is something that you guys want, that you're thinking about, that you can write about, it's a great venue and was such a smooth process. So thank you for that opportunity for us.
Someone might want to put the name of the journal and the link in the chat box, chat room.
I just did. I just did.
I will do that.
By the way, I want to echo what Punya said. I've been working with the journal, so it's a good place and for publishing. I want to make sure I give Chris some time. Chris was unmuting himself. I'm sure Chris has some ideas to share.
Well, it's an exciting conversation, and I'm enjoying all the different perspectives. I've been thinking about the fact that when I work with our graduate students, in a way, I'm trying to save them from going through what I went through in terms of just thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of experience in order to develop expertise. Part of what we're trying to do in education is short circuit that process. And I was thinking about silver lining for learning from that perspective. And what came to my mind was grand rounds in medicine. That one of the ways that you help people who've been through med school really short circuit how long it takes to become a medical professional is you go on grand rounds and you look at cases of different kinds, and you've got some experts with you who help you diagnose and help you understand what kind of remedies might be appropriate to propose. Now, education is more complicated than medicine. I'm sure I'm going to make people mad, but I don't think that one expert could do grant rounds in education. I think, in fact, just as an arbitrary number, 6 experts would be useful for doing grand rounds. And we've done that in a way informally because we brought in these different cases and then we've each talked about them. But that could be more deliberately designed, where for episodes, it would really be, here's a specific situation, but it's mirrored in many other places. And as sort of experts will each take a perspective on this that's somewhat different, and then see if that helps whoever is watching now or later to know how to handle situations like that better when they arise in their lives.
You know, that's actually when I was thinking about how I would call our group, I know Punya said we're the EdTech group. I think most of us now are beyond EdTech. You know, we're doing EdTech things, but you know, given our age, the color of our hairstyle, our hair, you know, whatever style, I think we're kind of beyond that early
What hair?
of EdTech. Well, yeah, what hair? That's good. That's good. So
You can find someone to cut the hair.
so what Chris was saying is just makes sense to us. Well, you know, Kurt, you still have some here. It is we are here both as a group of someone who knows something about this topic, but we're also inviting others come to this topic. We also have a very smart audience who is trying to do this as well. I think honestly, our challenge is to say, okay, how can we make this going on for a long time? That, you know, episode by episode, we're offering some kind of, you know, some kind of coverage of some issues to prompt someone to think about this. I think quite a lot of times when we go through a program, we have too big an ambition that you will become an expert on this, then suddenly, and that's actually may or may not happen. So I think this kind of program, you know, as we go along, it would be meaning a lot to have more interactions with people to think through these issues. You know, I'm very enjoying actually a lot of this chat, even though sometimes I cannot write back, but I look at the chat, I'm quite encouraged. What I'm hoping for is more people to join us. Maybe truly trying an early morning show might be worth it. I don't know.
No, I think in terms of immediately actionable, I think Kurt's idea of us rotating times makes great sense. It is more inclusive of the people who can join in. And I think it will just expand our audience. And I think we need to be sort of smart about, you know, who the guests are, who we invited that time. They would be people who typically we would not be able to get because of time zone constraints, right? So I think if we think smart about that, I think we can widen this for sure. And it's a relatively easy thing for us to do. But I want to come back to Chris's point. I love that idea. And so how can we combine that with Zhao's point, I think, of that this thing is growing and adding to sort of the body of knowledge, I think is worthwhile for us to think about really what kind of processes or systems can we create that allow for these conversations to snowball into something bigger, and without necessarily determining upfront what that something would be, because I think it could be many different things, right? Has the potential to be, but that would be sort of interesting to think about, is like through the website or through that, how do we foster these discussions of getting examples, getting different perspectives on maybe the same issue. And maybe there are people in the audience who might want to be a part of that, which is like, they can drop a challenge in and others can jump in and offer sort of like the crowdsourcing idea that Zhenya talked about. I mean, I think those are the kinds of things that would be really interesting to explore as we go forward.
Maybe we think about Chris's show. When are the Singaporeans and Koreans coming in, Chris?
On the 13th.
Of June?
13th.
So
of June.
Maybe that's the show we try a different time for, because then they're a 12-hour difference at least. So
yeah, they would be very appreciative of that. I'm an early morning person, so it's no problem for me. And I want to point out, for those of you who are late night people, just don't go to bed.
Hey, I've been trying.
Chris and I had this email exchange about that blog post where he was waking up and I was going to bed. It was ridiculous.
So, well, maybe we'll talk a little bit about it, but I want to leave something today, for all of us coming here to think about this. So we got a group of people who somehow by accident got together, began to talk about the silver lining. Okay, began to talk about silver lining. I think Shuangye was very important in this big thing. This was way before the disease spread in the US, prompted me to think about this. Then I invite you to chat with this. So far we've done more than 10. This is the 11th episode. So I mean, actually, let me lay out for all our audience as we think about things that we know that have changed. For example, no. First of all, let's forget about them. Forget about the damages, economic slowdown, the closings. We've lost hundreds of thousands of lives. That's for sure. And that's going to continue. Let's not forget that. That's something that have changed, has affected so many lives, and that's really, we need to remember that. And second of all, we have had billions of kids closed out of schools for a period of time. Whatever that period of time is, this has been unusual, unprecedented. This is globalizing. It is a global effect that nothing else has experienced in our generation, most of us. And the third thing that has happened is there is a small group of people, whoever they are, or maybe groups of people who are trying to reinvent education. Reinvent. There are a lot of people trying to push back to do the same thing. There are a group of people trying to reinvent. And that is the group I think we're speaking to. That's the group we're working with. And the future, Chris, going back to what you said, we're trying to intervene. Are we going to be successful in intervening? I don't know. I think the time is short. Many schools may still go back, try to make do, try to make what it was. And how successful we are, we don't know, but that still could be the mainstream. I think there is an urgency for us to take perhaps a more active role in shaping what the future could be, in sharing, in thinking, arguing, in making that case. I think that's one, so I want to really end there to say, that's where I think we are about. We're trying to do here. Anyone wants to come in before I announce next week? No?
No, I think we are in overall agreement on that. I don't think there is any doubt about that. I think there were some ideas expressed here today, which I think would be worthwhile for us to follow up on. I really want to follow through on the sort of the spin-off sort of an idea, because that was something I was wanting to do anyway. And it seems to make a lot of sense to tie it with Silver Lining, because I think it enriches both in terms of people and participation and so on. So.
Scott, is there anything, Scott, you want to read off the chat window coming from the audience that is important that we haven't talked about yet? Any comment or question that just anything critical?
No, I think right now we're discussing Yongjiao's comments about trauma, right? And how to adapt next school year, and recognizing what kids and families are going to bring with them, and how we may need to forefront that above content disparities or inequities that we're currently talking about in terms of learning loss, and how difficult that may be if we do that, if we're not face-to-face.
So with that, I think we just have this commitment. Everyone has a commitment. I'm just worried about us. When this whole thing stops, we forget. People can forget something fast, and then we pretend nothing happened. So let's emphasize that. So as this our Silver Lining for Learning is really about bringing different ideas. So next week, we're going to have two great guests, and that's let me actually make sure I get their name right, and make sure so we got Cecilia Aragon and Katie Davis, authors of the book called Writers in Sacred Gardens. And Scott, can I help you to type that in for me, please? Writers in Sacred Gardens from the University of Washington. And they're computer scientists in many ways, but have done something, touched on the issue about large learning environments, which I've been, this actually book, what's brought to my attention by Chris Didi actually mentioned that. I was fascinated by that, because I'm very interested in how people learn on their own. So this is the tracker on fan fiction clubs online. There's been a long history. So they've done research, they've been participating. It's going to be fascinating. I think in the long run, we will see a lot of online learning on our own. This is going to be, it's happening, on Scratch, and it's happened, many other ways. People are teaching each other. I think that's going to be in a new model of thinking. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with them. And Kurt and Chris, you're going to join me. And so this is actually something that we're going to be talking next week. And this is what I call self-autonomous or autonomous learning environments in many ways. So thank you guys and enjoy your day, and we will be better. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.